Thank you all for coming back after a break, or at least most. I'm pleased to start off our next panel with a particularly distinguished set of experienced participants here. I think if we look at the topic at hand of the Internet of Things, we are probably right now in the stage where the deployment of Internet of Things competes numerically with a number of newspaper and magazine articles that spilled about those devices. And one of the difficulties that I think we have is more so than in many other areas, when people talk about the Internet of Things, they all have a somewhat sector-specific notion. For some people, it's finally home automation that we've been talking about for, 30 years or so, where it's the robo-butler type of thing. For others, it's automating power plants or industrial processes. For others, it is medical applications. For others, it is vehicular transportation. And each of those really, what makes it, I think, unique is that it introduces a merger of cultures between IT, networking, software, depending on how you would like to look at it, electrical engineering, computer science, as well as then the respective industry culture, whether that's healthcare or aerospace or industrial or home or appliances type of things and so on. And so we have, I believe, a particularly qualified panel to look at all of those issues, both essentially the commonalities across all of those industry sectors and applications, as well as some of the areas that are more specific to, say, critical infrastructure that may not apply, say, to home automation. One final comment I think that struck me when I heard the last panel was that the Internet of Things has, even though you may not actually be in that industry, other parts of it may actually affect you. Some of you may have heard the story about the refrigerator that started sending out spam because they had an unpatched open source type of generic Unix platform running on it. And so even if you're not running home automation or whatever it happens to be, other devices that are in that space may suddenly start attacking you with a denial of service attack or become a bot of some other, in some other capacity. So with that, I'd like to just very briefly introduce our panel just by affiliation, and I'll ask each one to say a little bit about kind of which corner of the IoT space they have illuminated, so to say, in their work, and then say a few introductory remarks. So we'll start out with James Kaplan, who is a partner at McKinsey & Company, followed by Rima Qureshi, who's a senior vice president and chief strategy officer and head of merger and acquisition. That should keep you busy, at Ericsson. And finally, Tavi Simon, who's founder and president of the Synergia Foundation, I got that wrong, and GCIG commissioner now. And we'll start in alphabetical order.
I think you really hit one of the critical issues quite directly when you talked about this confluence of cultures between IT on the one hand and networking or manufacturing on the other. I spend a lot of time helping companies think through cybersecurity programs and cybersecurity strategies, and in many sectors you're seeing this interesting turbulence between IT and security around what might be called the Internet of Things. And so, for example, you see it in companies that are struggling with putting in place devices that look and feel like computers and have the security vulnerabilities of computers, but have not been managed like computers. And hospital networks are a terrific example of this. A medical device that goes into an operating room is basically a computer running Linux with a piece of plastic around it with the name of a device manufacturer rather than a piece of plastic around it that says Dell or HP. Traditionally, these devices have not been owned by the IT organization. and in many cases they've struggled with or have not been, security hasn't been a tremendous focus for them. At the same time, the manufacturers of these types of devices are also wrestling with the issue of, first off, how do they bring together product security and IT security as more of their devices become connected to networks, and also figuring out how to integrate their products into the security models for their customers. And again, hospital networks are a great example. I've seen situations where large hospital chains have delayed certain types of implementing certain types of diagnostic devices by a year or more because they couldn't figure out how to integrate it into their broader IT security model, say for their operating room environment. And then finally, I think there's some really interesting questions of signaling and trust, because it's not just enough to be secure, you also have to communicate to the market that you are secure. And I think in many places we're seeing turbulence around buying decisions where innovation is getting slowed down because people aren't sure which vendors they can trust and how much. So sorting through that, I think, will be especially important in coming years.
So I think going back to your comment about the number of articles and the number of things, if I may, I'd like to start with some numbers. If we look at 2014, there are 7.1 billion mobile phones. If we project out 5 years, that number grows to 9.5 billion mobile phones. And the amount of data traffic that we see in the networks today is going to increase about 8 times what we see in the networks today. If you ask 5 people, you'll get probably 10 different estimates on Internet of Things and how many things you will have connected to the network. But the numbers vary between 15 to about 50 billion connected things, of which 10 billion will be the phones, the smartphones that we talked about earlier. Another way of looking at it is everything, including phones, that can benefit from a connection will be connected. All industries will transform. All industries will benefit from the fact that you can get connected to the overall network, and the impacts to society, to the overall economy, far outweigh the benefits that each of the individual companies will make from the revenues associated to the Internet of Things. But all of that also represents challenges when you connect so many different things up into the network. The previous panel and the last speaker mentioned mobility is the next threat, if you will, as far as financial services is concerned. I think we need to stop thinking about phones as only something you make calls with, but actually look at all of those up to 50 billion connected things and what opportunities, but also what threats they can represent.
Good morning. I come with a little bit of an interdisciplinary background, so I would sort of try to explain it from that sort of a perspective, if that is okay. The first, the caveat, the general feeling that Internet of Things could become an Internet of fear. So that's the first thing that we are trying to, from a mindset perspective, trying to clear. The second is I would like to expand the construct of the threat of cybersecurity per se. Typically, it is looked as an ICT problem, or it is looked more like a computer problem. From what we have seen, cybersecurity is more issues that are related to things which come from the old school of warfare, which is you have your intelligence, your counterintelligence, your signal intelligence, your human intelligence, your social media, and a number of things put together, because you really don't need to get inside the computer to, I mean, in relative terms, to penetrate. Okay, so what are the challenges, especially with regard to the Internet of Things? So there are two. The biggest risk is the device themselves, as most of these devices have not been built with cybersecurity in mind. And the second is the pressure on companies to get products quickly to the market. So in most instances, you have product companies pushing the product into the market and hoping that as they are shipped, they can do the correction. So this is a big challenge. And then the second big challenge is on the platform. So most of the devices that are connected to the IoT are built on open source libraries and components, which are extremely vulnerable to cyber threats. Now, the challenge is always, as the person from Google mentioned yesterday, is to write secure codes. Now, from a market perspective, you see that a number of these products have to be sold at extremely cheap prices. So, the adage that your chain is strongest as much as it is when from the weakest link perspective. So if there is a weak link in your chain, then your entire supply chain becomes vulnerable. And the last bit that I would like to say is how and where these devices are used. So this is the third threat that you have, because you have instances where devices magically appear in the entire supply chain. So it's basically because departments don't communicate with each other when they bring in new tools into or systems into, or products into, and that one vulnerability in one area can affect the entire cyber security of the organization. I will sort of pause with that.
Okay. Let me see if I can, I think you raised a number of interesting issues that we should dive into in the time remaining in that. Maybe I'll try to structure it a little bit to give each of you a few minutes to think about as to what do you see compared to all the other cybersecurity issues that we talked about or that others have talked about on this stage and elsewhere in the financial sector, in the general IT type of sector that are unique to the Internet of Things. You mentioned one, namely the cost pressure certainly is one for that, but we have consumer devices elsewhere that have very thin margins, and we know manufacturers of PCs, for example, I won't mention any particular names, but start with L, that have had a recent history of shipping products that had security issues. And so are there particular concerns that manifest themselves in the IoT space that may require different remedies? And then I want to get, once we identify, what we have to deal with, as to how we can fix those, but I'll leave that till later. And the second question, they may be connected, so maybe I'll raise them at the same time, is do we have to worry about different kind of actors? In the financial sector, it's pretty obvious what motivates people, namely A, direct financial gain, and maybe B, kind of hacktivism and other non-financial interest. That's probably less interesting, the latter one. My financial gains may be less interesting to take over my refrigerator. It isn't just financially valuable, except they can spoil my food, but then nobody else gains any benefit from that. What is likely to motivate people to go after, say, hospital devices or electric utility type of devices? Does that also shape our response that we should have, both at the engineering side as well as during the operation side and the whole life cycle of a device integration and so on? So if you want to, you can, anybody want to start with that? Yeah, please.
Sorry.
No, please.
Yeah. So if I could start with the first one, what is different or unique to the Internet of Things? I think one aspect to keep in mind is the characteristics of an IoT device. Some devices, if you were to look, for example, in the agriculture sector or in the utilities, smart meters as an example, you're going to require these devices to be in the network 10 years battery life, and they are in some cases very remote, so you don't have the ability to go and modify them on a regular basis. So that's very different than what you might have with your phone, which you charge on a daily basis, or your PC. So you have limited processing capacity. They're usually embedded in some way, And as a consequence, what you can actually build into that device, the processing capability is very limited. So that means that it is vulnerable. To your second point, it isn't the fact that your fridge, somebody can hack into your fridge and spoil your food or whatever else. It's the fact that your fridge is connected to the rest of your network. And the fact that if you are a public utility and you have a smart meter that has a chip or a modem that is low capacity, low power, that is a backdoor into the big systems because it's all connected. So those are the threats and the risks associated specifically to IoT.
Here's what I'd say is, first of which to me, Internet of Things from a security standpoint, at some levels, the dog that didn't bark yet. There have not been, I think, major public breaches related to the Internet of Things. I think that's partially driven by the fact that the Internet of Things is still nascent as yet. But I think you very well could see, I like the phrase, the Internet of Fear. And I think your point's about billions of connected devices. At some level, that development, which is I think we're all sort of counting on for innovation and growth, is contingent on not winding up with the Internet of Fear. So I think the development of security models for the Internet of Things will be critical to the development of the Internet of Things itself, and therefore continued innovation and economic growth. Second, I do agree there's potentially, at least in some cases, a different set of attackers related to the Internet of Things. Just using hospital networks as an example, because especially familiar with a few. Yeah, they're concerned about potentially nation-state attacks. Obviously highly dependent on the geopolitical environment. They're concerned about hacktivists, given that, as an example, healthcare can be highly fraught emotionally as a sector. And also, as with other types of technology devices, they're concerned about personal information. Very sensitive information can be housed on medical devices. In terms of what needs to be done, obviously I think that it'll be important to converge IT security models and product security models, but one thing I would emphasize especially is the quality of the software development, both for the device and for all the applications that surround it, and both are important because the vulnerabilities will often be at the seams between the two. And I think we're going to need to see much higher quality application development in coming years. That I don't think necessarily means more expensive application development. There's an expression that a vulnerability is just another type of flaw, and it's reasonably cheap to eliminate these types of things at the beginning of the software development process, and hideously expensive to do it at the end of the software development process. So I think the capability of our developers will become much more important.
And before I get to the remedy side, so to say, what we should do collectively or individually, so to say, in different sectors, any more on what you see as kind of from your particular critical infrastructure side as the kind of motivation in people that we would need to worry about in particular?
Good question. Now, I look at it this way. Who is the adversary? If classically, if the adversary is a nation state, then okay, this could be the motivation. Okay? But your adversary could be a hate group. It could be a terrorist group. It could be a ransom group. Okay? And this whole threat has become so asymmetric that all you need is 3 or 4 people. And what could be their objective? It could be just to create fear. And if you ask what is the benefit they derive out of it, and most terrorist organizations, the whole objective is just to create fear. I mean, terrorists, splinter groups, whatever you call it. So I think it will be very interesting to look deeper into what is the motivation, but that would be something we would find it very difficult to answer with growing all the complexity. For example, we had an instance in Bangalore in India where a young boy, 22-year-old engineer, was arrested for tweeting for the ISIS. Now, he has nothing to do with ISIS. He has never visited Iraq, Iran, anywhere. But he just picked this up on the net. Now look at it playing out further. When he was arrested, and this news was released out by the Secret Service in London, he was arrested, the ISIS issued threats to the police in Bangalore, saying that if you don't release him, we will come after you. And the Peshmergas, the Kurds, were celebrating. Now, nothing to do with each other. So if you look at the sort of asymmetry in the thought, so this is the first thing. Second, if cyber was only technology and writing codes and the security parameter, then we can give. But the problem is most people who come from the technology world do not know the larger ecosystem, and that is the challenge. How do you teach them, the human intelligence, the social intelligence, which may not be directly related to what you do inside the office?
I take issue with something you said, because I think there's something interesting here. I could not agree with you more strongly that cybersecurity is not purely a technical issue. Obviously, technical aspects of it are incredibly important, but it's not a technical issue. I would, however, suggest the metaphor of thinking of it in terms of conflict or warfare, which many companies do, I think, is at some level not entirely helpful. I actually would suggest instead you need to use a risk management metaphor, and I would make the case, anything you do with regard to technology implies risk. If you're launching a new mobile platform, that creates new types of risk. If you're launching a new product with new types of information, that creates risk. And I would suggest the issue is, okay, what risk are we incurring? Because we have to. If we're putting new things, if we're creating new new types of connected medical devices or new types of sensors in the supply chain, we are accepting risk. But how do we balance the risk and the return? And what's the best way to optimize that trade-off?
And I would agree, because that is definitely what we look at when we have to develop and commit to characteristics and capabilities. I mean, there were discussions previously, are software companies willing to step up and make commitments? If you look at telecommunications networks, we have to guarantee 5 nines. And what that means is any one point of failure cannot be failing more than 5 minutes per year.
Right.
And that is liable with penalties if you don't meet that requirement. So that is something that you can determine what the cost is to be able to do that.
And over many years of the industry, it's developed, it's 5 nines, but it's not 6 nines.
No, because it's considered to be too expensive to go beyond a certain percentage, and that's what you build your system for.
It's high, but it's not absolute.
Yeah.
So let me just see if we can. I want to just say, move. What should we do collectively? And I want to see if we can separate, based on what you said earlier, 3 types of somewhat separable problem areas, namely one where IoT, as much as anything else, and certainly mobile devices, given kind of a relatively small number of operating systems, also fall into that category, is they rely on a large, partially open source, partially commercial software infrastructure that's built by people you don't know as a vendor. You've never met, they may not even be knowable in some sense, because they've built over 30 years of software development. And then we have kind of industry-specific functionality that you build, whether it's a medical device, whether it's energy, a smart meter, very different, specific, but often, I think, as you alluded to, built by people who are great power engineers, but probably took a Fortran programming course, if you're lucky, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I suppose, in that case. And then thirdly is the integration into larger system, where the system itself may be reasonably safe, but you suddenly assumed that you were operating in an environment that didn't have certain threats, and suddenly, because of other devices that you introduced, what you thought was safely inside a perimeter no longer is. And I'll give you an example just simply because it's an area that I'm familiar with, is initially in the voice of IP world, people thought, oh, PBX and phones, they're inside the corporate network. Mm-hmm. And so we don't have to, we can use unsecured file transfer protocol, what's known as trivial file transfer protocol, to transfer credentials and software updates and all of that. And then suddenly they discovered that people would install these devices at home as an extension for their home office when they were telecommuting. And all of the assumptions that were reasonable when the product was shipped, or at least not completely ludicrous, suddenly turned out to be just completely wrong and with predictable consequences. And so I wonder, does that help? How can we, if that separation into concerns is a right way to think about it, how can we address each one of those, kind of foundational infrastructure, the industry-specific one, and the integration risks, if you like, or process integration risks? And feel free to just tackle one or any one of those topics, if you like.
Let me start with the process integration risk, because in some respects those I think are the most interesting and the most challenging. And I expect it's both an organizational and a commercial issue for the providers. And I think the era of having product security teams which are siloed from network cybersecurity teams or enterprise IT cybersecurity, it's just, that has to come to an end. Right? There's, I think, too many things that get lost when you're not looking, for example, as a service as an end-to-end system, right? The second thing is, I think, for the providers, they need to spend much more time with their customers. I know I used hospital devices as an interesting one, but you want to see a group of angry folks go mention, any one of a number of device manufacturers to hospital CISOs, and it's, gee, they're shipping us product and they have no idea. The perspective is, inherently the box may not be secure, but they're shipping us product and they've never given 5 minutes of thought to how we would integrate it into our environments. So I think for manufacturers, it's going to mean a lot more time spent working with their customers, figuring out what the use cases of installation are, and then pressure testing those, both from traditional penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, as well as scenario-based wargaming, to understand, okay, what could go wrong, and how do they jointly move from products to sort of secure scenarios for implementation.
So there's so many different aspects, there's so many ways to address the question, but I think on the one hand, I completely agree, the integration is a huge challenge, and I think that challenge is becoming even bigger. Actually, it is a huge opportunity as a private enterprise to make money. And in some respects, you could even say as a way to add additional complexity to continue to make money. So that's something to be aware of and monitor. On the other hand, even if we had one way of doing things, we still have to take into account the legacy systems and how you do the integration. So there will always be a need for integration, and I think that need will continue to grow. There is a need to have standards where applicable, common architectures where it makes sense, and as much as possible, guidelines that are followed across the industry when it is open source, as much as possible. You have to make it so that even though you are not able to control everything that is being done because it is done in open source, but that there are certain principles that as much as possible people respect and adhere to. I think testing requirements, the ability to find errors, when do you deliver the software, like alpha testing, beta testing, that kind of stuff. And then negative testing as much as possible so that you're not only looking to make sure that something works, but you actually try to break it to make sure that when it does break, that it doesn't break something else in the process. These are established ways of working, and we just need to ensure that that's the kind of thing that is understood that everybody needs to do.
Question for you on because the open source one is
right.
especially interesting, obviously, given Heartbleed. Do you think companies need to be making more resources available for their technical employees to participate in the open source community?
It depends where you are within the community. I think it depends also, there's pros and cons, right? So I mean, I'm coming from an organization and an industry that is extremely standardized and regulated.
Right.
So it's not open source. It's actually very much, you get everybody together within the industry, you make sure that everything works well together, And that ensures that there is a certain level of security. Yes, we are moving towards a world that is more open, that requires us to work a different way. And to your point, we need to probably put more people to take some of those principles of a standardized industry more into the open source space. Now, if I can come back to your other point, if we can, the way that we have this concept of if we can just keep it, if we can just touch it, somehow we can keep it safe and we can control it. I think that's also a concept we have to put aside, really, because everything is going into the cloud. It's not going to be something that you can actually put a firewall around. It will be somewhere where you don't even know where it is, and you don't know where it's going next. So the idea of what is security is no longer firewalls. It is about timestamping and data security. So the concept of security and the concept of cybersecurity is also transforming. And that also needs to be taken into account in terms of the standards of how you develop products.
So in the critical infrastructure area, do you see that there are principles that either exist and they just haven't been followed because people thought of them as safety principles that deal with electric arcing as opposed to, gas leaks, as opposed to kind of the equivalent versions on the software side? Or are there things that either in terms of training or in terms of processes that we need to do? There's obviously plenty of ISO type of standards that companies profess to adhere to. That doesn't seem to have made, in my biased opinion, all that much practical difference because it tends to be checkbox marking as opposed to actual cultural change. You both are coming, all three of you actually coming from industry, or at least are very familiar with industries that supposedly have a safety culture. Medical type of one certainly has one. You mentioned the telecom reliability culture and to some second degree safety culture. And certainly in the critical infrastructure, civil engineering, mechanical engineering safety culture that's been, or electrical power engineering safety culture that's really been ingrained in any budding participant, whether it's a doctor, or technician, or a power engineer for decades now. But still, that doesn't seem to have been sufficient so far based on what you have said.
I don't think people have always drawn the connection.
Okay.
One of the interesting things 3 years ago, I was working with a mining company on their cybersecurity strategy. At one point, and I had no idea what the hell he was talking about because I don't know a lot about mining, he said, this is just like safety. And it was interesting, they had a corporate culture where, you did not walk around headquarters with a coffee cup with an open lid, right? Because you don't walk around a mine with, an open liquid, and you would get written up with a ticket if you walk down a flight of stairs again in headquarters without grabbing the banister because, you just never did that in the mine. And I think once they made that jump and said, cybersecurity is no different than safety, then they started to inject cybersecurity into their safety program, which had been very successful over the course of a decade. And it was just, then the culture started to say, okay, it's no different. And I imagine there must be similar things that happen in electrical utilities given, the intensity of the safety culture in that type of sector.
I might make just three. I totally agree with Professor that what you said, and just 3 points that I might quickly share. One, if there is a remedy, the first one is ensuring that there is an ecosystem where the supply chain there's some sort of a very strict rating. And this is something which the industry has to take it on themselves, because there's no other way. You cannot try to bring in heavy regulations. It won't work. And it's like trying to solve 21st century problem with a 19th century, sort of a red. The second most important thing, I think, is about information sharing. And this is a huge problem that, even within companies, they don't talk to each other. With one department does, the other person doesn't know. So that seems to be, if you look at, forget companies, even if you look at from a national security perspective, very few people know what the other department is doing. We call it turf war, but it's something that happens. Okay, and finally, I think what could be helpful is some sort of a soft regulation, in which there is sort of a co-opting between the government and the private industry, that it is not sort of pushed down on them, but they see that there is an existential need for them to do it. Otherwise, there could be disruptions, there could be anything that they will not be in business.
So that actually naturally segues into kind of a question as to, on a larger scale, besides the internal one, is since the consequences, since you mentioned, in all of the cases that you have, this is true in telecom, this is true certainly in medical, certainly true in infrastructure, go far beyond the company itself. In a sense, their risk is limited to going bankrupt. Our risk is, at best, our risk respectively as users of those is far larger, both financially, potentially, and personal safety in many cases. So if you were to look at models that work to ensure that the problem always is the race to the bottom problem, because you can't, as you mentioned early on, you can't see security in a sense that the box looks as shiny as the other one, maybe even shinier because it may actually have newer features that were thrown in at the last minute and have a new user interface or whatever. So what is the kind of more modern version? I'll mention as one example to get the discussion started something that I've always been somewhat surprised by. As some of you know, I work part-time at a federal regulator that doesn't deal with safety as such, but we deal with cybersecurity. And so we have companies coming into the process as, no, don't regulate us, we'll all do it internally, and then bad things happen. But then on the other side, we have industry, which says, particularly since we had the financial services panel, I suspect most of you are familiar with PCI DSS, kind of a program which is essentially both a checkbox program and a ongoing testing program for anybody who accepts credit cards. So for a sideline business that I run, I'm subject to that, so I'm somewhat personally familiar with that. So it's an industry one, which is in many ways...
Do you think it makes your business more secure?
I'll say partially. The checkbox one doesn't. What I think does actually help, and this is something that is, and this is the ongoing piece, namely, and again, that's maybe something you can talk about as well, is there's often been one of, because it's probably closer to what we do in other engineering, is you design a secure product and then the security itself doesn't change much. The bridge doesn't have to be updated. That came up during the previous panel as well. The PCI DSS model, because it does monthly or roughly monthly testing, make sure that you have a new version of underlying software, SSH, OpenSSL, Linux, whatever it happens to be. And if new threats evolve that can be tested externally, not all of which can, it tests for those even though they were not known at design time. These are like the Heartbleed type of model where somebody discovers a new threat vector that just wasn't thought about at the time of design. And we've obviously had now the NIST framework, security framework, which is a more process-oriented operational framework in that. So I'm curious, in each of your respective niches or experiences, is what models work? Is it one of specifying, basically, we'll leave you alone, but kind of if you can't behave yourself, so to say, well, basically the threat of regulation steps in. But then you actually have to be willing to execute on that. Because sooner or later, somebody will misbehave, and you don't know ahead of time who's that going to be. You probably can guess, but you don't know that ahead of time with legal certainty. You can't just say, you look like a cheap guy, I'm going to regulate you, but because you got the expensive suit, I'm not going to regulate you. That doesn't work. So how do you make that work? And what level? Is it processes? You mentioned that a little bit in your telecom experience. Or is it a checklist type of thing? Or is it, what is the right model for either, and who should be specifying those in that? And I think that's a fairly broad discussion, so we can dive into different aspects of that. I don't know, if you want to start.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so.
Yeah, so actually, we did, working with the World Economic Forum, we did some research about a year or so ago, where we surveyed a large number of technology executives on a range of security-related issues, including what they thought about regulation. And the distinction in results across sectors was, I think, very interesting. So in financial services, the sort of modal result was that CIOs and CISOs were saying that regulation is actively harmful, that it was mandating practices that in some cases were somewhat outdated, and that it was chewing up tremendous amounts of time that could be devoted to other things. And you heard people say things like there were, you'd heard we got quotes like, there's what we need to do to be secure, there's what we need to do to be compliant, and those two things have nothing to do with each other. We have to do both. You heard heard folks say things like, between all the different regulators in the U.S. and all the different jurisdictions abroad, that they had 97 different audit events that touched on security in some way, shape, or form. That's at one institution. It was very different in other sectors, and in particular in healthcare and in insurance. The sort of modal result was, regulation is inherently suboptimal, but still helpful, because our sector has not focused on this in the way that it should. So at least it gets senior management to devote the required time and attention. Now, when we asked what type of regulation would make the most sense, almost everyone said, it should not be specific technical practices that changes too quickly. It should be somewhat principle/result based. So obviously, that's harder to implement and harder to describe.
So, and you'll each chime in on that, but I'd like to think about, that comes up a lot. I mean, regulators can never be quick enough to do that. But is there a way to do that in a two-step? In many industries, as far as I understand, it's essentially regulation by reference. Namely, that the regulator itself doesn't specify, you shall change your password to take a silly rule that I would put into it doesn't actually make a safer model, don't write down your password type thing, rules, to a specific one, as opposed to referring to industry standards that can evolve relatively quickly.
In some industries, regulators will get quite that specific.
Right. And so, is that a right model in a sense, regulation by reference, in a sense that you say, we don't tell you as a national or international segment regulator, you shall follow these particular practices or particular checkoff items, but you should follow whatever the current industry best practices are, as opposed to simply be safe in that, and we'll know it when we see it, but by that time it might be kind of late to do that. So what would be the models? And you can go back, or you can start with that.
Yeah, so maybe go back, if I may, to the initial question. The industry, IT industry, as well as the telecom industry that I'm working in, I would say it's a combination of all of the above. So it's a combination of regulation, industry standardization, internal architecture models and processes that are put in place that everybody are required to follow, to basically open source, where it's free for all. So all of that exists within the ICT industry, if you will. Then going back to the ISO and the checkbox is definitely the case. You have industry standards or regulated requirements on where you have to comply. It's processes. It doesn't address security. What it does is it allows you to say, yes, you have this document, it's in the right version, it's been signed by the right person, and it's been stored in the right place. It doesn't say anything about whether there's any valuable information in the document. So that's an issue. That is definitely the basic, absolute minimum that everybody needs to comply to, in my opinion. Beyond that, you have what the industry tries to do to regulate itself, and the challenge we have within the convergence of the industries. is that you've got one industry that's coming from a regulated, standardized way of working, and one which is a startup can make billions of dollars even if they don't make any revenues if they have a good idea. And those things are colliding. That's creating challenges. And that's creating discrepancies in which is the best way to work. So we have to work through those things.
Just as a note, I've heard for many businesses that are in the traditional, more regulated, more cautious model who are competing with businesses in the startup feel they're at a disadvantage, that this is part of the reason that it's hard for them to innovate as quickly.
You could say that in a lot of cases is excuses, but let's take the Internet of Things as an example, okay? So coming from the regulated to the completely unregulated approach. So in the regulated approach, which is the traditional telecom approach, where you've got chipsets, you've got patents, you've got standards from an industry perspective, a chipset for an Internet of Things today in a device would cost you around $20. Okay, so that limits the amount of devices that that chip is going to go into. Of course, that cost is coming down, and that cost will go down to about $5 next year, by the end of next year. On the other end of the spectrum, you have chipsets that are selling for less than 50 cents. Those are getting into a lot more devices. Those do not have the same level of security, but they are going to coexist. And it's, again, the issue of the weakest link.
Specifically, where do you see the difference in security in the software level or the standards one? Because if you look at the industry, just to say that, if you look at the cellular industry, they don't have a completely unblemished record, GSM being a pretty good example of having pretty lousy security in many ways, SS7 having no security, just to take two examples, because they assumed that they were only companies of your size, your company size, would be playing in that space and would be too difficult to build your own SS7 node, your own GSM base station, whatever. In that. So where do you see the 50 cents and the $25 one?
Both have things to improve, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I'm not saying that the $20 solution is the one that is working and there are no issues whatsoever to the previous panel. We are absolutely having to do more, but the fact is that if you've got these two ways that are coexisting, two ways of doing things that are coexisting, how do you regulate that industry? How do you create standards and architecture that everyone will be able to adhere to and comply to? That becomes a challenge. And then the requirements on each aspects of these technologies is very different as well. Going back to what I said previously, if you're trying to create a device that's going to live out in the network for 10, 20 years, it's not going to require a new battery, and it's not going to require you to go and touch it after you've installed it. There's only so much processing power that's available to actually put any type of security into it. Maybe it's not under threat, and maybe we don't have to worry about it. But I mean, if I just think about all of the industries, going from agriculture to utilities, the ones that are going to grow the most in the next 5 years, agriculture, maybe not a concern. If you put something out in the field to make sure there's enough irrigation, chances are that's not going to be a security threat. Automotive, that's going to grow quite significantly. Intelligent buildings are going to grow quite significantly. Utilities and consumer electronics. So if you look at those specific industries, we need to start evaluating where is their biggest threat, and then ensure that in those specific industries that there are maybe some basic requirements that everybody has to adhere to. That's where the growth is going to come from. Intelligent buildings, in my view, is a potential area to be concerned about, because if you can, in some cases that we have talked about earlier today, go in through an HVAC system and bring down a whole network, you got to be careful what kind of intelligent buildings you're creating. Utilities as well, you can bring down a whole power grid. So maybe there's a certain level of security that's required in that industry that maybe you don't need in the agriculture side. I think it may have to go that way than to say 50 billion connected devices, everybody needs to comply to this standard.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Just a quick one. As James had said, that if the narrative of cybersecurity is more risk mitigation, then the challenge is, if you look at risk, people believe, why try to fix something that isn't broken? Okay? So unless it's broken, you have the real threat, nobody wants to spend the money. I mean, we have faced it several times when you talk about threat mitigation. There was an instance, and the second one, the instance in the US about Bradley. A diabetic patient some time back was using a wireless insulin pump, and he went and complained to the device manufacturer and the regulatory authorities that he feels that his wireless insulin pump could be tampered. So as a consequence, the FDA started working on a regulation. Okay, so I feel that you cannot just allow, good practices to come in, because companies do not know what's around the corner, because they are focused on the product. They want the best product, the best packaging, the best market. But the threat is something that is not under the ambit, understanding the threat. And even if companies understand the threat, you have risk managers who might say that, let's postpone it for another quarter.
So I wanted to pick up, since you've mentioned it a few times along the way, and it's a particular concern of mine as well, about the life cycle issue. What should be, and your example highlighted that as well, is what should be the obligation of a company, not just when they ship the product, and of any other industry player, when they ship the product, but 10 years out? And what do we do in cases, for example, where that company is no longer around or has long moved on to, Cisco and Ericsson and other companies have done lots of things, smartphones in some cases, just to pick on that example. Cisco was in consumer products at some point. They're no longer doing either one of those. And what should happen? Should these devices automatically kind of self-destruct when they can't phone home anymore and find when basically their parents are gone, so to say? Or who's responsible for those type of long 10, 20-year life cycles of devices?
To me, the challenge would be to sort of trace them back. Once it's gone into the market after 1 year, 2 year, nobody knows where it is. It is just gone. So I think logistically it will be very difficult to sort of kill it unless you program it in such a way that, after 5 years or 6 years, it self-destructs. Something like that.
They could phone home.
Yeah, possible.
They could.
Yeah.
It's not like a car,
No.
the old model car,
Yeah.
where once it's on the road, gets sold several times, and who knows who owns it.
Yeah.
But for recall, how to reach the owner at that point, or how to. The whole point of Internet of Things is these are devices that are connected to the network, so they can certainly make themselves known to that I'm still around, regardless of whether this building got sold a few times in the building management, or the building manager has moved and has changed hands a few times, and the blueprints are no longer up to date. Is that something that one should, just as a good design practice, built into network devices? People have proposed that essentially devices self-safe, so that if it can't establish contact with a home base, it goes into some kind of safe mode that essentially allows its safety functions to continue, but it makes it known to the local one to start blinking or whatever, that it either needs to be removed or maintained in that. Whatever models for the life cycle management that you can think of. And this is true, I think, across all industries that we've talked about.
It's very interesting. I think there are certain capabilities and solutions that exist today to be able to do that. Similar type of things. So companies are definitely putting in place software locks, software keys, that as soon as it's clear that your contract has run out, the software stops working. So from a technology perspective, it is definitely possible to do that, and it's easy also to do it from a hardware perspective. We have been faced with specifically that type of question. It's like we are selling Internet of Things solutions to a particular company. We are asked to support these things for 10 years, and it has to be written into the contract. So that is what you sign up for. And then you have to ensure that you have all of the hardware and the software and the capabilities to be able to support it for that period of time. And we have walked away because we don't want to make that type of a commitment in certain cases because specifically, as you say, you're not sure if the person that's going to be supplying you the widgets are going to be around 10 years from now. But that's not necessarily the case all the time, right? So you may not have somebody that signed up to support it, or you may not have someone that's walked away and said this is not a good business. It may just be that there are things out there and nobody is supporting it. I think it's a very important area to address as we go forward. But we'll see a lot more growth before we actually get to the point. There's probably about, depends how you count, it's about 1 billion connected things right now. That's growing to 25 billion in 5 years. So there's going to be a lot of growth before you get to a point where you have to figure out what to do with the old stuff.
Actually, it's interesting. It's an interesting example of how security could be, the incentives could be, the commercial incentives could facilitate security rather than discourage it, which is, obviously many software vendors have used the inability, have used the inability to support software from a security standpoint as a lever to encourage upgrade. But you could imagine a model where, okay, one of the ways we manage life cycle, not lifestyle, is the device has to phone home, and everyone understands that the life, giving an evolving security environment, the lifespan is not infinite. That we need to, after some point you have to replace the darn thing so that it can be replaced with something that continues to be securable.
But I think it also brings up the question of whose responsibility and liability is it? If you have sold it, how much responsibility and liability do you have? At some point, you have to be able to step away from it. I mean, we've had similar type of discussions when we've talked about electronic waste and legislation on electronic waste in Europe, for example. If you've sold it to someone else, how much liability do you have going forward to find out where that stuff is and dispose of it? It's the same concept here.
It's a great example of security as a legal issue.
Yep.
Which is, a lot of this will presumably get sorted out contractually, and I know lots of folks are negotiating hard about this, where companies will specify, okay, we'll take exactly this risk and no more. If you do this and this and this, we have some liability, but if you don't install or support it in the appropriate way, then you bear. Exactly. You as the customer bear the liability.
But I've yet to see a product, either on the commercial or on the consumer side, which says this product has a built-in life cycle limitation of 10 years, and even I think operating systems have gotten better, the major ones. They basically, at the time you buy it, they basically tell you that we'll end of life this device at a certain point. But in many cases, unless you're towards the end of that, you won't know. I mean, if you bought Windows, some version more recent than that, XP, for example, I'm pretty sure during most of its life cycle, you had no idea how long after you purchased it, it would still be supported. You only knew once when it ended. Microsoft, in that case, decided it was nearing its end of life phase. But should there be a disclosure requirement if I buy a home smoke alarm, just to take a life-critical device, that says, you don't just have to change the battery during daylight savings time, switch over, but 10 years from now, in a commercial building, say, you have to expect that you should replace that, and when you factor in the cost of purchasing device, you should, is that the model? I mean, what is the model for that?
Well, I would argue the reverse is true on the enterprise IT side. It's not that the vendors have been, vague about when they retire things. I would say, okay, gee, it's going end of life X date, and then, invariably there's a few years extension as a result of begging and pleading and what have you. Oh my God, we can't possibly get off XP by this date. You have to extend support by a couple of years, right?
But it is an important area to consider. But I like the idea of the self-destruct. That generates future sales. I think that's a good idea.
But it creates, I think, rather than regulation, because I can't even imagine what an intelligent regulatory model would look like. To me, it's more on, can we create positively reinforcing commercial mechanisms to encourage security. It feels like that's going to be a lot more effective in a much more efficient way.
So what would be the challenge on that? Because that's what everybody says, but when I ask about specifics, it's usually...
Well, I mean, this is a great example. I think you're going to, I think you're already seeing it in, RFP processes. And, for example, in banking, I know not only of technology deals, but even financial transactions that are held up because counterparties saying, gee, I don't understand where how you're managing the data end to end and which vendors you're transmitting this data to. And that is, quite clearly encouraging, financial institutions and other types of companies to think in a much more intentional way about how they're transmitting data. I think I think the sort of, the shoe that hasn't dropped is the consumer markets. Because you're starting to see it in business-to-business markets. I don't think you've seen much yet in the way of consumer behavior driving more secure products and more secure services.
I wanted to, looking at time available, I want to make sure we have a few minutes left for questions from the audience. I think we've touched a number of topics that I'm sure people in the audience have questions or short opinions about. So I see a hand there and a hand back there, if you're green shirt.
Thank you for your comments. I have two questions related to consumer privacy.
And I'm sorry, if you could just briefly state who you are, just...
I'm Camille Gray. So two questions relating to consumer privacy. First, what do you think about data breach notification laws? Congress has been debating different bills. Do you think those help security? Secondly, regarding devices, consumer devices, and connected cars and such, do you think that self-help should be employed? It seems like these devices don't turn off and they're always collecting data. What role do you think self-help should be? Thank you.
Of all the regulations you might consider, to me, disclosure ones or notification ones, are easier to describe. And then second, and by the way, this is a personal opinion, not an opinion of McKinsey & Company, obviously, it sort of reinforces the commercial pressures on cybersecurity. So if we know when stuff happens, then that increases the likelihood that customers of various types will be asking the tough questions.
There's back there.
Hi, Carolina Rossini from Public Knowledge. You mentioned what we all know as the Internet of Things, right? And one of my increasing concerns with the Internet of the Things is that actually things are, in terms of statistics, many more than people, right? And that means that from a theory of network of communications, which is how we see the Internet nowadays, we might change for a view of a network of control, right? Because you need to take care of all these things, right? So how you balance all the values that come with the Internet of communication in a network of control? How do we preserve freedom of expression? How do we preserve privacy? One of the things that gave me like goosebumps, right? In the plane the other day was the documentary on the new Barbie doll connected to the cloud, right? So how do you balance, when you have young kids, right? You have to be concerned with those. How do you balance the values from these two very different networks that are the same at the end of the day? Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if anybody, we haven't talked much about the privacy aspect, but it's obviously related in some sense to the cybersecurity side, more in terms of unintentional disclosure, but it also bleeds into the intentional disclosure or use of data to the consumer. And from a consumer perspective, it probably doesn't much matter as to whether the bad guy got the data or a company did things that you didn't expect, even though they're not nominally a bad guy. And not any thoughts on any of you that would matter? For example, when in the home, do we have to worry about that smart meters suddenly track my behavior indirectly in that, or in mobile health devices, consumer devices? They know a lot about me as to where I am, what I'm doing in some sense, how active I am, just as one that insurance companies, a health insurance company might care about how fast I'm driving, that my car insurance company cares about, and maybe the whole advertising issues, or certainly in the health world, you mentioned those early on. Are those two connected, or should we treat those separately?
Just a quick one.
Yep.
I think the issue is it's a choice that we make. The day we decide to get into the net, we have accepted, we have actually signed that, our lives are going to be open. So any time that you get into the system, then talking to, we have to just say how much of privacy we want. The more private you want to be, the less disconnected you are to the grid.
So is the only choice that the consumer has essentially disconnect or accept any privacy violation that they perceive?
I'm not going to that extreme, but I'm just saying, no, I'm not going to. But all I'm saying is it's a choice that we have to make. Then it's like
an individual choice, or is it also a societal choice?
Both. I feel it's both. But at the end of it, you can't blame the society for something that happens in your house. So the buck would stop with me if I have to take a decision.
I think the benefits outweigh the risks. There are risks. It's important to educate yourself of the risks. But imagine what life was like before the internet, and are we willing to go back to that? I think that's the other thing to keep in mind. There's so many benefits, and so much of what we get today in terms of just the way we live is coming from the internet. If we don't have it, I think that is a huge risk versus the threats that you have of using it. But it is extremely important to educate yourself. Going back to your example of the connected Barbie doll, I have two teenage daughters, and it's extremely important that I educate them on the risks of the internet. And very, very important for them to understand what they should do and what they shouldn't do. And I think that applies to all of us. We need to understand what the risks are at the same time as there are huge benefits.
Absolutely.
I see a hand up there on the table. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the panel. My name is Yuri Ito. I am from JPSA, Japanese Computer Emergency Response Team. You talked a little bit about the product liability, vendor's liability on this. How do you think the insurance role is coming into this?
Insurance. Well, product reliability requirements are in some respects regulated, so that is the responsibility of the industry that's providing those type of products to ensure that they're capable of delivering those products. And then if there are liabilities associated to it, of course, the enterprise or the private sector is trying to limit that liability as much as possible, because there are requirements in some cases to have unlimited liability, but you try to cap that as much as possible. And then, of course, when you can, you try to get some of that covered via insurance that you have on an enterprise level. So insurance is a backstop, but that isn't going to cover all of the liability that you would take on if you are developing these solutions. But it's not every aspect of the ICT sector that understands and accepts liability. I would say the vast majority doesn't.
Anybody else? We talked about, there was a little bit of talk in the previous panel that Steve Bellovan mentioned it, that insurance itself, in order to be insurable, this is not so much for the ICT development side, but more for entities that use products, that the products have to meet certain insurance given product requirements in the sense of fire safety being a classic, electrical safety, vehicular safety being examples of insurance rating that determines your car insurance rate for a collision.
I'll give you a great example of an app. There's an app called Drive Like a Girl. And if you install this app and you drive well, your insurance costs actually go down. So you keep track of your insurance, your driving habits, and then your insurance costs can go down.
But would the insurance itself drive product features and requirements as it may have happened in other in safety relevant ones? And I'm looking at you particularly because it seems like particularly relevant, or maybe in your case as well, medical liability insurance one. Would there be in either one of those cases, let's say a medical liability insurer would say, if you use products that are not meeting those requirements, our liability that either something goes wrong in patient care or something goes wrong in data disclosure rises, and so your insurance premium is going to go up, or we're just not insurable. We won't write a policy on you. Do you see that as a realistic possibility? People talk about it all the time. I haven't seen much happening yet. You want to?
I mean, a couple of thoughts on subject. One is, it's an incredibly nascent market, right? And I think, the amount that the insurance companies are willing to underwrite for any given customer is quite small. And for example, I know one company that did manage to get $200 million in aggregate cybersecurity insurance, but had to create its own syndicate of 8 different carriers, each providing $25 million of insurance. And needless to say, that was a excruciatingly painful process, and the coverage still doesn't 100% align, and so forth. To me, this goes back a little bit to disclosure and notification. At this point, there's still not tremendously good data out there in the world about what events have happened, what their impacts have been, and as more of that comes to bear, it'll become easier for richer cybersecurity insurance markets develop, which would be incredibly valuable because you can start to then price risk, and you could price the impact of certain mitigation strategies potentially.
Okay. I want to give everybody a chance to say some closing words, things that we didn't get to discuss. This is obviously a very broad topic that spans anything from electrical and software engineering all the way to societal policies in that. Anything and either any of you would like to add to that? Otherwise, it's always would be a panel that's between you and lunch, so to say. Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, I would just make a last statement that, today you have a scenario where everything can be connected. So in the same vein, you have the risk that everything can be hacked. So that's the, I would just try to conclude like that.
I'd say as we've had this discussion, there's this very rich array of, strategic product development, commercial, contracting, legal, a liability, procurement type issues, which I think gets at the richness or the full complexity of the topic. If major institutions continue to treat cybersecurity as largely speaking a technical issue, we're not going to make the type of progress we need as a society, and that is going to get in the way of, the 50 billion odd connected devices getting the value that I think we all expect and want from the Internet of Things.
I mean, I suspect this won't be the last discussion on this particular topic, particularly as you said, we're in nascent phases of the deployment, and often we necessarily tend to be reactive to the latest kind of disaster, or hopefully near disaster, that we can get. So thank you so much for sharing your insights from very different but converging industry perspectives to that, and thank you to the audience for the questions that you added to the discussion. And I think the next agenda item is to have Internet of Food out there, the old humankind that can network there, and I will be seeing you. What is the next item is at 12:45. We have a keynote, a lunch keynote here. Thank you so much.